Okay, we're in our final chapter of Soldier's Heart, and this chapter is entitled June 1867, chapter 10. He could remember all the sweet things when it had started. Waving pretty girls, southern summer mornings, cheering children, dew on the leaves. Even when all his thoughts came on to being gray and raining, and the parades were done, and the dances were done, and the killing, well, he thought of it as butchery more than killing, was at last done. He could remember all of the pretty things. He was 21 now, just getting to the age where he should be studying on marriage and raising some young ones, finding some land to improve and work. But it wouldn't be that way for him. No, he was too old. Not old in years. In years, he still hadn't started daily shaving or even learned about women. But in other ways, he was old. Old from too much life. Old from seeing too much. Old from knowing too much. He was tired, and he was broken, walking with a cane, passing blood in his stool. He knew it wouldn't be long for him. In some ways, it made him sad. Some days, it made him near glad to think of it. So many of the men he knew were already there, gone across. He thought maybe it wouldn't be so bad to go across, to get away from this constant pain and the sounds that he couldn't stop hearing. On this fine summer morning near Winona, Minnesota, he walked out along the river, limped was more like it, to have himself a picnic. He carried a feed sack with half a loaf of bread and some of Agile Peterson's cheese, and a chunk of roast beef with fat in it, and a jar of cold coffee. That was one thing that had stuck with him. The army had taught him to like coffee, live on coffee, and he still drank it, even though it really didn't make his gut feel good. Coffee and beans. He could still sit to a meal of coffee and beans and a little pork belly and not feel too starved. But not for a picnic. Not for this picnic today. He wasn't sure in the fact that he would even eat. He'd come out on many such picnics before, not sure that he would eat. He just liked to sit at the river and wonder if it was finally time to go visit the others. Always he'd eaten, had coffee, and then walked, limped, back to his small house at the edge of town. He'd heard it called a shack, Charlie's shack, but he thought more of it as a proper house. He found a place where a soft breeze kept the mosquitoes away from him. The sun warmed the grass and the dirt, and some rocks in the river made rippling sounds. He stopped and with great effort lowered himself down into a sitting position. He sat with his legs straight out in front of him. It was kind of an awkward position, but his knees no longer could bend, and he couldn't lie back on the grass because it would make him sick to lay down. So he sat, watching the river go by, awkwardly. Then he reached into the sack and took out the cheese and the bread and set them on a small rock nearby. Then, as he removed the jar of coffee, his hands brushed the other things in the sack, and he took it out and put it on the rock near the bread and the cheese. It was a .36 caliber cap and ball revolver that he'd taken off the body of a Confederate officer. Charlie had known the man was dead, because he'd just killed him. He remembered taking the man's revolver. Everybody wanted those things, those Confederate revolvers. Back home, they'd always write to him saying, "Pick me up a Confederate pistol," they'd tell him in the letters, as if he just picked it up off the ground, as if they weren't being carried by Confederate soldiers, who obviously didn't want to give them away, as if you wouldn't have to kill a man to get that revolver. He shook his head. That wasn't one of the things he liked to think about. The revolver shone in the sun. It was clean and free of rust and corrosion, greased and capped and fully loaded. The walnut grips so shiny they looked deep and almost red. It's a pretty thing, he thought. The revolver was as pretty as anything he'd ever seen, black and shining. He held it up for a moment, hefting it. He eased the hammer back until it clicked, looked at his finger on the trigger, and knew that if he touched it just there, just a light touch, it would trip the hammer, slap the percussion cap, set off the powder, and send that little .36 caliber ball speeding out of his barrel and right into his... He eased the hammer down with his thumb, and he laid the pistol back on the rock next to the cheese. And then he sat, listening to the rippling of the river, watching the water go by, thinking, trying to think of pretty things. That's the end of our chapter and the end of our book. Now, because this is historical fiction and it is based on a true character, we have an author's note to read, which I will read with you now. This is partly work of fiction, partly fact. Charlie Goddard really did exist. He enlisted in the 1st Minnesota Volunteers when he was just 14, lying about his age, and fought through virtually the entire war. I have had to take some minor liberties with timing, because no man could have been everywhere at once. Charlie, for instance, did not fight at Bull Run, although that was about the only battle he missed. He did not fight because he had been laid up with dysentery during the time. In all other respects, everything in this book happened, either to Charlie or as a true story that happened to men in the Civil War. Every event is factual to my research, including the building of the wall of dead bodies to stop the wind for the surgeons. Charlie really did receive wounds at Gettysburg. The destruction at Gettysburg was nearly biblical in its proportions. More men were killed there in 2 hours than in all the previous American wars, the Revolution included. When the Battle of Gettysburg was finished and they'd made their fateful charge, only 47 men were left standing of the 1,000 original soldiers of the 1st Minnesota Volunteers. Charlie was not one of them. He was hit severely, and though they patched him up as best they could, he managed to fight in later actions. His wounds would never heal properly, nor did his mental anguish. When the war was finished, he went back and tried to hold jobs, but he could never end up holding one. Eventually, he ran for county clerk on the basis of his war record and because people respected him. He was elected, but before he could even serve as the county clerk, his wounds and the stress took him, and he died in December of 1868. He was just 23 years old. So remember, the name of our book is Soldier's Heart, and this idea that really PTSD is a serious mental condition that happens to people that have experienced trauma, and soldiers so often come back from war experiencing horrible PTSD. One of the highest groups of people, demographic is what we call that, but one of the highest groups of people for suicide are Army veterans. There are people that have come back from war because the experiences that they have had to go through, the death that they've seen, the killing they've had to, partake in, really is difficult for them to ignore. And many times this shows up in night terrors. It shows up in just kind of constant worry or stress or anxiety. And then it also can cause actual mental illness to occur to the point where they're not really functioning the way they were before. Mr. Birmingham's grandfather, who's no longer alive today, but he had participated in World War II, and I'm sure many of you have heard these types of stories. He had fought in World War II, left for World War II, a young father with 2 little boys at home and a loving wife, and they had a great relationship. And he came back from that war, an alcoholic who, when he was drunk, he would beat his wife, really had bad relations, strained relations with his 2 sons growing up, was really not able to hold good jobs, really struggled. And so much of that alcoholism is due to them trying to deal with what they've just experienced. He never talked about it. And many, many soldiers are that way, that they keep it inside, they keep it to themselves. And that's one of the big reasons why when you've had a traumatic event happen to you, whether it's as serious as fighting in a war, or it's as small as something that happened in your childhood that really still bothers you, if you're still contemplating it and thinking about it and it kind of consumes you, that's why counseling can be such an amazing opportunity to be able to get it off your chest. It's a strange thing that humans need to talk about things, but we do. It wasn't always acceptable, especially for men. For many years, it was the manly thing to do, is to toughen up, get over it. Men don't cry. And, science has shown us that that is not the way to deal with things. And so really now they're encouraging people, even not just PTSD, people to say, you know what, go and talk to someone, either a trusted person that you trust, that you feel comfortable talking with. That could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a coach, or go to a professional person. Sometimes that's helpful because then they don't know us and we don't know them, and we can kind of spill things that maybe we wouldn't say to somebody, or say some of those thoughts that we've had that we might not want to say to like a parent or a teacher. But you can say that to that trusted adult and they can help you. They can give you strategies and coping mechanisms. And of course, as Christians, we can always turn to the Lord. The Lord is there to guide us. His Spirit can heal. Many people have found great healing through counseling, through many different health procedures, through healthy lifestyle, and of course, through our Heavenly Father. So it's not a hopeless situation, but it is a devastating result of sin in our earth. Next week, we're going to be talking about PTSD very briefly for our last writing activity for the year. So kind of be thinking about that as we go into next week and how you see PTSD. Do you see it as an actual wound? Do you see it as a weakness? Do you see it as strength? Do you see it as something that isn't anybody's fault? Kind of be thinking about PTSD because next week we're going to do a short opinion writing on it. All right. Thank you guys for joining me in our journey through Soldier's Heart. Hope you enjoyed the book.